Creating Value Wins. I'm here with my fellow co-hosts, Doug Kirkpatrick and Hunter Hastings, and we have been working together for a couple of years on the challenge of creating value. And we are honored today to have with us a special guest, Harvard Business School professor Felix Oberholzer, and the author of the amazing book, Better, Simpler Strategy, a value-based guide to exceptional performance. Creating value is a huge subject, and I believe that Felix is the very best person in the world to guide us through this subject, having spent several decades doing intense research with practitioners and quantifying it, and he has been systematically finding out what works and how well it works and where it doesn't work. And so we're going to dive right in. So, Felix, you have an amazing slide here in your book, which begins by addressing a question that really bothered me when I was working at the World Bank as a manager. How is it that so many big, powerful organizations with massive resources, brilliant staff, working hard, talented, often have little to show for their hard work, while other firms seem to be racing ahead of the pack, as the slide shows? How do these firms on the far right get so far ahead of the many firms which are bunched up on the left? What on earth is going on?
First off, thank you for having me, Steve, Hunter, and Doug. It's a great pleasure to be here to speak to kindred spirits about the importance of value creation. Yeah, the data, I agree, is super interesting. In fact, you will find funny, when I first downloaded it now many years ago, an earlier version of the data set, I thought I must have made a mistake. Like somehow I didn't catch the right data, or something strange happened. And what there are really three things that struck me as particularly interesting about the data. The first is sort of the bunching of the companies in the middle. So many companies that have very similar returns on invested capital. In fact, if I ask you of a company, you never even heard the name, and I ask you what's their return on invested capital, and you say, well, probably, 5-10%. Almost always you're right. How is that? Why isn't it that we see much more dispersion, or many companies being farther from one another apart? So that's like a first really interesting observation. The second interesting observation is the left-hand tail. I certainly always thought of capital markets as being very impatient. The moment you don't do the right thing, you have not so great quarterly results. You're almost gone. And here we see, no, actually, even companies with negative returns, so very far away from the benchmark that every company needs to meet their cost of capital at a minimum, and these companies survive over long periods of time. And then, of course, the best part, the most inspiring part, the right-hand side of the distribution, where you see companies that, over a decade, I'm looking at a long period here. I'm not interested in, did you have a great quarter? Did you have a great year? I'm interested in these long-run differences in performance. And you see 20% return on invested capital, 25, 30. So like, what on earth is going on? What's the secret sauce? So I agree. It's incredibly interesting to see. And then the answer from about the most successful firms just ends up being super, super simple. They're doing one of two things. They're increasing the willingness to pay of customers, or they're decreasing the willingness to sell of employees and of suppliers.
Well, it's very, very fascinating data, Felix. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being here today. And your book suggests that complexity is one of the major culprits behind this challenge. And we have lots of inconsistent frameworks and goals, objectives, and people lose sight of the forest for the trees. And that suggests that radically simplifying strategy through a value lens could be extremely beneficial. Could you unpack that a little bit? And are there cautionary tales about which we could learn more about this challenge? And are there success stories?
Yeah, it's a great question, Doug. The heartbreaking part about the story is that most of the efforts that end up undermining the performance potential of companies come from a good place. right? I want to be really engaged in work. I want to be really ambitious. I want to do a million different things. And before you know it, we have dozens of initiatives. We have hundreds of projects. We're all real. When you think about it, like every company I visit, I write many cases, and so I end up visiting many companies. Every company I visit, people are incredibly busy. And then also we have the best educated workforce in human history. And how can it be that all that engagement, all that hard work does not really pay off? If you look at the average performance here, it's just maybe cost of capital plus 1%, plus 2%, but it's not really impressive. And I think it comes from, in an interesting way, doing too many things, too many initiatives, too many projects, many of which don't link back to the only two things that matter, which is the customer's willingness to pay and the employees and the suppliers' willingness to sell. So I imagine a boardroom where we start a conversation, and then the moment it starts, everybody goes to, oh, if we do this project, will it increase willingness to pay? Will it decrease willingness to sell? If the answer is no, or we're not so sure, end of conversation, because we know it cannot bring anything positive to the organization. But that's not what we do, right? We like the sense that we don't have all our eggs in one basket. We like the sense that there's a lot going on. And as a result, when I work with companies and we just look at a long list of their initiatives, I find that sometimes for 20%, sometimes for 40, 50%, recently at a company, 2/3 of the initiatives, we didn't really have a story. If we execute perfectly, if we're really good at execution, we didn't really have a story how we would create value, how we would increase willingness to pay or decrease willingness to sell. And then, of course, that means we're incredibly busy and we have not much to show for it.
So, Felix, this is Hunter. Let me ask you a question about the tool that we're looking at in two parts. You talk about creating value and emphasize it's for customers, for employees, and for suppliers all at the same time. So you might talk us through that combination a little bit. And then that cute little drawing we're seeing on screen is called the value stick tool. And you might tell us a little bit more about how people use the tool, and including the value maps that it generates. So we don't see the value maps on our slide, but we see the tool.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So the idea really is that when I looked at the companies out in the tail, the superstars that do really, really well, it's forever the same story that gets repeated. They're either really, really fantastic at increasing willingness to pay. And of course, when we talk about in willingness to pay, we think about customers. In particular, that is the most a customer would ever pay for a product or a service. So I raise the price, I raise the price. At some point, the customer is going to say, love the product, love the service, but it's just too expensive. Now I've hit the customer's willingness to pay. And then at the bottom of the value stick is willingness to sell, which is the same idea for employees and for suppliers. So imagine you're in some negotiation with one of your main suppliers. And of course, you're thinking, oh, I don't want to overpay. I'm going to squeeze my supplier a little bit. And so you lower the price, you lower the price, you lower the price. And at some point, the supplier is going to say, actually, Hunter, I love working with you. You're an amazing company, and we've been working with one another for a very long time, but you understand it's just not enough money. Now you hit the supplier's willingness to sell, or the same is true for employees. If we are negotiating compensation, there is an offer that you can make. Even I love the job. I would like to do it. But in the end, if compensation is below my willingness to sell, it's not a job that I'm interested in. And so all financial firepower, if you will, comes from finding ways to make that value stick longer. And once the value stick is really long, you can then start raising prices without hurting customers. So customer delight is the value that goes to customers. That's the difference between willingness to pay and price. Or you create incredible working conditions, like really, like people just love working at your company. That is, the minimum compensation that they require is fairly low because it's such a great place to work. And as a result, you don't need to pay at the top of the scale and you get really good talent. So value gets divided up in three ways. Some of it goes to customers, some of it goes to employees and suppliers. And the middle wedge, that's the operating margin. That's what we get to keep. And when we think about these distributions in the return on invested capital, that's basically saying, where does that come from? And there's two answers. Well, there's the length of the value stick. You got to be really good at creating a ton of value. And then you have to find a way to capture a fraction of that value. And that is just a function of, is your value stick different from everybody else's? That's a last really important idea. If the customer looks at 7 value sticks and they all look the same, how would you choose? You choose based on price. And as a result, the company will find it really hard to be profitable because there's all this pricing pressure. Or if I'm an employee and I'm looking for work and I see 7 companies that have exactly the same working conditions, willingness to sell is the same everywhere, which job would I pick? Whoever pays the most. That is at the cost of your margins, makes it hard to be really profitable. So that's this. I have found this value stick tool. It's so simple, right? But it summarizes the dynamics, what goes into value creation and ultimately profitability in a really fascinating and I think very powerful way.
I was struck by a couple of things. One was that the increasing the willingness to pay, there are the many different ways that you describe to achieve that without actually paying for it. That you find out there are some things the customer really doesn't care about, and so you can go short on those, but you really give the things that the customer is desperate, absolutely must have, and you find out what that is. So you're able to raise the price without increasing costs. At the other end, I'm sort of fascinated by how the lowering of costs works out. That you say, well, it'd be such a great place to work, so that you don't need to pay the people so much. I mean, how does that apply to the CEO and the senior executives and what we've observed by Oliver Williamson's work on Slack, how a large part of the resources of the company sort of disappear into the pockets of the. How does that weave into these calculations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So every time you increase willingness to pay or decrease willingness to sell, you get two effects. The first effect is just financial flexibility. So if I have higher willingness to pay, I get to charge premium prices. If I have lower willingness to sell, I don't have to pay at the top of the scale. So that's the financial flexibility piece. And then the second effect, and sometimes that's actually even more important, is the selection effect. If people see, oh my God, like someone has created a product or service, willingness to pay and price really far apart, these people will be attracted to that kind of work or to that kind of product. I'll give you a practical example. If you look at statistics of employees at Uber, one of the first things that you notice is that many more women drive for Uber than for taxi companies. You think, okay, so how did they do this? Because on an hour by hour basis, actually Uber pays a little less than the traditional taxi company. And the answer is, well, they've created a job that is more flexible and a job that is safer. And as a result, you are so much more competitive in attracting women to a profession where not many women feel very comfortable to begin with. And so always think when you think about willingness to pay and willingness to sell, always think about both of these effects. And so the same goes for CEOs. If you go out and you have like an incredible pay package, and maybe, it's options granted at a valuation that look incredibly attractive. Yes, everybody likes money, so you will get a lot of applications. But who are these people who mostly chase a really big paycheck? is that exactly who you want? Or do you want someone who cares about the mission of the business? Do you want someone who cares about operations in the business? Is there someone who's dedicated to making the industry a more successful place? And so on and so on. So we always want to, I'm not saying that money doesn't work somehow. Yeah, money works, of course. But what money doesn't do is, if you're mostly, in particular on the employee side, if you're mostly competing on the size of compensation, you get a random selection of people who apply to your business, because last I checked, everybody likes money. If you mix it and say, our job is extra special in so many ways, and then we're not paying just as much as some other companies would pay, you get a selection of people who really, truly value what your company is all about.
Correct. And you mentioned Hugo, it's an interesting case, because I always ask the driver, are you happy? And I've actually yet to meet an Uber driver who is content. That they're often women, as you say, but they are often feel that they are not being treated well in terms of pay, and they find it grueling work. So maybe it's my neighborhood where, or maybe I'm taking the wrong kind of Uber. But
yeah. So an interesting, closely related question that you can ask is, many of them, in particular the older workforce, many of them have been taxi drivers at some point in time. Ask them if they will go back to driving a taxi. Mm-hmm. And I bet everybody would say no. Right? So it's not so much that when we think about value creation that we can sort of build things that are incredible for everyone. But what we know is, if we create more value, either for the passengers or for the drivers, then I think we're doing something that makes people better off compared to other options that they had in their lives.
Yeah, value is always relative. That's the axiom.
That's right. Yes, that's exactly right.
Well, Felix, you described the changing the willingness to sell very well, and I'm curious about something that popped up in the HBR article that you discussed in focusing on very discrete, simple value drivers and eliminating the complexity. You talked about perhaps looking at clusters of value drivers. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit and describe in what kinds of circumstances clustering makes sense and maybe when it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So I think it's incredibly powerful to think about willingness to pay and willingness to sell as sort of these big guideposts. But then to make this really actionable, you need to understand, what are all the things that go into willingness to pay? What are all the things that go into willingness to sell? And so we typically call these value drivers. So think about your bank. You care about probably the safety of your money. You care about how good is the mobile app. You care about how close is the branch. You care about many, many things that you care about. And what we often do is that we order these value drivers from most important to least important. And we're thinking about ways to create big differences between my position, what my bank is doing, and what, Doug, your bank is doing at this moment in time. And once we start brainstorming and thinking about, okay, so we want to improve convenience. And we're saying, oh, actually, it would be more convenient if, say, you could get a loan really quickly because I know your credit history. And so it wouldn't be like a complicated application process. Most of our ideas will not neatly fit into the criteria that I specified to begin with. Because now with the loan idea, I have an idea that increases your convenience. So that was part of your willingness to pay, but it also increases the fact that you like now your app a little better. You're going to use it a little more often because I have loan products and other products. And so the idea is, when we then brainstorm about what are the very many ways in which we could create value, the value drivers, what the customer wants, that's not a one-for-one match. Most of our ideas will touch on many similar value drivers at one and the same time. The key thing here is to just focus on just a few things. I usually, when I work with companies, I usually try to push them towards just thinking about one or two value drivers, and I'm rarely exactly successful. So we end up maybe with 3 or 4. But the idea is, if you want to be better at 17 things, I already know that's not going to happen, because you can't be better at 17. You don't have the resources. You didn't have the time to be better at 17 things. So really focus on 1 or 2 that have the most potential to help you in competition with other companies, and then really focus on these 1 or 2. And when you look at the conversations in organizations, the organizations around what could we do better, what innovative ideas do we have? Oh my God, that's so much fun! Like it's engaging, it's interesting. We're laughing, like everything is amazing. The conversation around what is it that we will not do? What are the value drivers that we will not pay attention to at all? Like, what's our plan? How we're going to disappoint customers. If you don't have a plan how you will disappoint your customers, you don't have a plan for delighting customers. Because these two things are two sides of the same coin. Like, we don't have disappointment. We don't have the resources to have delight. And so that is the part, I think, that is just very difficult for us, because we want to be good at everything, right? We're engaged. We love the company we work for. And so we're pushing on too many fronts, and it undermines the success that we could have had if we did fewer things.
It strikes me that the genius of this is that you've clearly defined these 2 dimensions, which is the clarifying idea in the whole scheme of things. And often we come across innovators who only want to talk about increasing the willingness to pay, and they don't pay very much attention at all to the things at the bottom. And in particular, the things at the bottom, I think about the budget discussions in a conventional organization where everyone, all the executives come to the budget discussion armed to the teeth to defend their territory, to defend their thing, their initiative, what they're delivering value, and to tell someone that their pride and joy is the thing that is not adding value. I can't imagine that discussion is very collegial in many organizations, unless there's been a lot of preparatory work to enable people to see what the point of it all is. So how does that work in practice?
Yeah, so one of the really beautiful things about the value stick is exactly what you point out, Steve, that it's all data driven. In the end, this is not about anecdotes. This is not about what we believe in. I'm not sure what your experience is, but I find often when I talk to executives teams of really successful companies, and say, oh my God, you had like an amazing year. You had the track record is just impeccable. Why? How do you do it? Very often I get 4 or 5 different stories where it's actually, even for the executive team, it's quite difficult to figure out, okay, so we're doing really, really well. What out of the million things that we do, what are the low-bearing activities that we have? Like, what really pushes the organization? And this is, of course, where careful measurement comes in. I would maybe point to 3 tools. If you just want to know what is really important for customer or employees, there is a statistical tool called MaxDiff that is probably the best at doing this. If I do a MaxDiff analysis, I take all the criteria that I think matter to customers, and I take all the criteria that matter to employees, and I show them maybe 4 or 5 at a time, and I ask, what's the most important? What's the least important? And then I show the next 5, what's the most important? What's the least important? That gives you an ordering of all these criteria. Because if you go out and you ask customers, so if I'm the customer of a company and they come and ask you, what do you want? Of course, what I'm going to say is, I want everything and I want it for free. That's not exactly helpful if you're trying to choose where to prioritize, where to spend your resources. And so MaxDiff is really good at that. And then out of the marketing toolkit, we have something called conjoint analysis, where, say, you wonder what's the willingness to pay of customers for longer battery life. And what you do again is like you show 3 different phones, and some have longer battery life, some have bigger screens, some have different colors, and they come at different price points. And if I choose among the 3 or 4, and if I do this repeatedly, I can back out what's the willingness to pay for an extra 5 hours of battery life or something like this. So there's real discipline here, because ultimately everything is grounded. You will have noticed one thing that's funny about the value stick is the company is in the middle, but the top of the value stick is the customer, and the bottom of the value stick is employees and suppliers. It's actually not the company itself. And so here, strategy is really from outside in. We're looking to customers and their preferences, and we measure these preferences, and we're looking to the preferences of employees. Now, I will say on the customer side, I think much of this is very well understood. On the willingness to sell side, I see so few companies that are serious about measuring the preferences of their employees. Give you one shocking statistic. If you look at OECD data, so this is like a club of rich countries, a third of companies, large companies often, know absolutely nothing about their employees. I mean, they know Social Security and they know addresses and these kinds of things, but they have no idea. Say, if I ask you to show up in the office at 9 a.m, does that mean you're stuck in traffic for an hour and a half? Like that moment when you put on the uniform in the morning, is that a moment of pride? Is that the moment that you dread? Like companies are, and we would never forgive you if you were in the dark about your customers in this particular way. But apparently being completely in the dark about the people who work for you, that's totally okay. And so I see so much potential in the willingness to sell side to really create value in enormous ways.
Good. So Felix, one last question referring to the title of your book. You're suggesting that strategy is better when it's simpler, and we understand the value stick's pretty simple, but everything you just said sounds pretty complicated with the max diff and all the various calculations and the multiple inputs and all the employees and suppliers you got to deal with, and it sounds not necessarily simple. So why do you say it's simple?
So I say it's simple because in the end, there's just these 2 metrics. There's just willingness to pay, and there's willingness to sell. So let me ask you a question. Like, you run some business. How important is agentic AI for you? Oh my God, we could probably spend 17 episodes of a podcast talking about this, because it's really complicated. Maybe it's really promising. Maybe it's a disaster because it's not going to work well, and so on and so on. And so in the end, the simplicity comes from we're just asking agentic AI, does it increase your willingness to pay? Does it decrease your willingness to sell? If the answer is no, or we're not sure, moving on. And of course, these answers might change over time, but that becomes the yardstick for everything. And that is actually something that even before measurement, I think you want to build this sense of this orientation towards value creation, almost like an ethos in your organization, that everything we do, everything we think about. And if I may, I can tell you a quick story, a personal experience that is in the book. I have a friend who lives in Los Angeles, and I sent her flowers for her birthday. And then one year I forgot. I don't know exactly what happened, but it's in my calendar, and I usually pay attention to my calendar, but somehow her day came and went, I didn't send the flowers. So I noticed a couple of weeks later, I call a flower store in LA right that moment. I order my flowers, and the salesperson asks, should we send the flowers today, or is it good enough if we send it tomorrow? And I say, well, a little embarrassing. I forgot my friend's birthday. It would be really great if you could send the flowers as quickly as possible. And she says, much to my surprise, should we take the blame? Should we say it was our fault that the flowers did not get delivered? And that, I think, is this ethos that I'm thinking about, right? So in every moment, like, it was very interesting. It surprised me a lot that she said that. But I'm also thinking, oh, she's not in the business of selling flowers. She's in the business of creating value for her customers. And that comes in all forms and shapes. Often when I visit companies, I see like 31 interesting things that happen in terms of value creation. And then I always do my interviews with the CEO at the very end. And I would say, oh my God, I saw this thing. It's really unbelievable. And half the time, the CEO has no idea that this is even happening in her organization. And I think what is happening is that once you have that value orientation, there's so many things that can happen in a really decentralized fashion that then improve the work environment, improve the culture, improve customer experiences in so many ways. And so, yes, can we build a technical apparatus with measurement to guide the big investments that we might want to make? Absolutely. I think that's something we can do. But even more important than that, I think it's really this orientation.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
And in our discussion so far, we've kind of been assuming that it's obvious that creating value is what's important. And you've obviously been a leading voice in that, and this group is obviously believes that and has an intent on promoting that idea, which not a new idea, of course, but around for hundreds of thousands of years, but seems to have gotten lost in business. But in fact, over the last 100 years, it's really been a different kind of thing has been driving things, that short-run profits, shareholder value, executive compensation has been at the top of the agenda. And that even today, when I talk to close friends and say, oh, I'm working on value creation, they say, what's that? What? Why are you wasting your time on such a stupid subject? Why don't you get a real job?
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, as you look around the world, where do we stand? We had this sort of maximizing shareholder value movement for 40 years or so. It had a supposed renunciation, which was supposed. Didn't change the actions of many companies. What chance does this have in the overall scheme of things? Is this a growing movement? Is it just beginning? Or I keep finding unexpected places where it's strong but kind of hidden, and people have been sort of doing it on private but haven't. How big is this? What can we do to actually make it the way everything happens?
Yeah. So I think one of the things to realize is, even if we just focus on profitability, profitability is a consequence, it's the result of having created value. So even this is sort of this mildly strange thing in business, that even if we were completely selfish, we didn't really, ultimately, we don't care about our customers, we don't care about employees. Like, what's the best way to be incredibly successful financially? The answer is by creating value for someone else. And I think we often don't think about it that way, but financial profitability is the end result of having created value. Unless you have created value, there is ultimately no profitability. And when we look at the returns on invested capital, there are many companies that are just, not that profitable, not that differentiated from everybody, the bunching in the distribution that we saw at the very end, because that's exactly what they don't do right. They don't focus on value creation. And then I will say, don't imagine you have to be, NVIDIA or Apple or like this incredible company to do this well. In fact, if we do a little thought experiment, say you have 100 company in a particular industry and you're ranked 50th. So I'm making you exactly average. Now I'm moving you from rank 50 to rank 40. So not a superstar company. You're just a little better than you used to be because you created more value. Your return on invested capital will jump by almost 5 percentage points. So even like a partial refocusing on what made companies great maybe many years ago in some instances, that is like incredibly powerful. And it also means we get to be imaginative and we get to be creative, and going to work will be so much more fun.
Absolutely. And we've tried to obviously embed this in our mantra, creating value wins. That it's very simple. If you create value, you win. You make more money and have a much better life than if you were focused on making money. But if you can help us spread this word, if you can help us make contact, we're having no problem recruiting speakers or popping up all over the place. But if you can find the best voices, the strongest voices, we'd really appreciate that. And we have a conference coming up in September, and I hope that I'll give you the date later, and you see whether you can find a way. It'll be an online conference, and
I would love that.
But if you could carry the word, because I think this is not just a word for business; it's a word for life. It's a way to have a meaningful life as well as a meaningful business. And I think your work has been a real huge contribution to it. So congratulations, thanks, and
thank you, Steve.
I hope this is the beginning of a long, happy, beautiful relationship.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I greatly enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Felix.
Thank you, Felix.
Now for something completely different. We've been talking a lot of exciting new ideas, and in fact, many conferences and workshops and podcasts talk only about the exciting new ideas, but there's also a lot of bad stuff going around. And so we decided to, in our podcast, have a weekly segment, The World's Dumbest Idea, and invite world's dumbest management idea, and invite the speaker, in this case Felix, to select the idea in his view, which is the world's dumbest management idea, the most problem-causing management idea. So it was Hugo who suggested this crazy idea of having a weekly identification of the world's worst management ideas. So I'd like him to explain what Felix has selected as the worst management idea for this week. Hugo?
Thank you, Steve. Felix's choice of the dumbest idea is the lazy language, like flywheel and ecosystem. These terms can mean anything and mostly nothing. Ecosystem, for instance, is used to describe complements, indirect network effects, umbrella branding, bundling, and many other ideas. Of course, each of these terms have radically different strategic implications, and lazy language, and even worse, this lazy thinking, obscures these differences and leads to common strategic mistakes. Hunter, I'd like to bring you up as well, so more examples of this lazy language. Well, like all the live things we have, it's you're muted, Hunter. We know you're practicing, and now you. Whoop. There you go.
I'm going to nominate all the language in the organization chart. So the organization chart is the worst possible metaphor to put into people's minds. It's a machine metaphor that everything has to be constructed rigidly, hierarchically, in layers, with reporting lines and budgets that Steve talked about, rigid processes all over the place, and focuses people on the wrong things like control, and politics, and promotion and self-aggrandizement and the budget battles that Steve talked about. It's not the orientation to value creation that Felix told us we should have. So organizations should be focused externally on markets and customer needs. It requires emotion and discernment and human values. There's none of that in the org chart. So I'm nominating the org chart and asking us to get rid of it.
Thank you, Hunter. And what about you, Doug?
So I think your nomination, Hunter, is excellent. And I would advocate that the dumbest management idea is the word management. So management comes from a French origin, which is about horse handling, and manier, which is handling, and it has to do with classes and centralized power and command and control. So management's about certain people, certain classes of people directing other people. And that is problematic in the world of AI and networked organizations and value creation itself. And it bleeds into very dehumanizing language. So we talk about human resources. Well, as Henry Mintzberg said, people aren't resources, they're human beings. And it's time our language reflected that. We talk about man hours as if women don't exist. We talk about head count as if people are disembodied without heads. And we need to get away from this dehumanizing sense of treating people like resources and recognize that they're human beings. And I think when we do that, we get right to Felix's idea of building up the willingness to sell on the part of workers. Because when they're treated like human beings, they're going to be more engaged and deliver more value creation. So changing language, starting with the word management, is what's important to me.
So I'd like to finish up with one of my favorite bad ideas, Bullshit Jobs, a wonderful book by David Graeber, who systematically studied organizations and found that at least 40% of staff in organizations were doing things that they knew was adding no value, that they saw no point in, but they kept doing it simply because that was their job. So just imagine if you look at an organization which has 100,000 people, 40,000 of those people are doing things that have no point to them or to the organization. So the scope for improvement is so extraordinary. It's almost unbelievable. So we could start to understand why it's easy for people in Felix's workshop to find ways in which they can create value out of seeming nothingness. In organizations, there's huge amount of waste in the form of these bullshit jobs. And this is a huge part of the whole value creation movement. And so we have a whole set of different ideas occurring, and good ideas and ideas that need to be expunged. And this is a whole vast change in society. Felix called it an ethos when you're in this new mode. It's not just another way of doing things this week, that we go back to the old way next week. This is something for life. It's reflected in the book Finite and Infinite Games. But when you're playing an infinite game, you're not just doing something for this week or this quarter or this year. You're doing something which is part of your life. And so this is actually creating meaning into working life, which is so lacking in many, many jobs throughout the world. So this vast change is occurring not just in the US, it's occurring, as Felix's studies show, it's all around the world, in all leading economies. This is a new way of doing things. It's not just tech, which is innovating, it's every sector. And so this is a vast thing that's happening in terms of creating value. And it is occurring because in the 21st century, creating value wins. So in this weekly podcast, we'll be exploring all the big issues and the nooks and crannies of this amazing change that's happening in society. It's interesting that the Drucker Forum just the last few weeks has announced that they will be focusing on value creation in the coming, their annual conference in November. So this is just another sign that this is actually happening. And in the next week, we also have Mark Packard joining us, who will be talking about his wonderful book, The Venture Mode, about how this different way of running organizations is so productive and so enjoyable to the people actually doing it. So exciting. It's a very different way. And so this is a weekly show. It will be every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern, but you can actually watch it. If you missed the show, you can catch it later. It stays live for at least a week. And we will be hoping to see you at our next session with Mark Packard next week. Thanks very much for joining today, and look forward to being with you next week.
Thank you. And I'd like also to thank you to our audience, Johan, Caroline, Joseph, Kathleen, all of them, Michael, that they've been supporting us online through LinkedIn Live. Thank you so much to all of them and other contributors for this podcast. Patricia, Elias, also there are the producers, and thank you so much to everyone participating here with us weekly on Thursdays. Same time, same place. See you next week.